Hey everybody, John Finn, Church Without Walls International, CWOWI.org. We're a house church network. We celebrate the gathering of the saints the way they did for the first 300 years or so in the early church and the way it's done around the world today, to one degree or another. It's just the West that's a little bit behind, I think, in this. Anyway, we meet in homes. The house church is the church meeting, and it's not part of a satellite, congregational auditorium-based church or anything else. And what makes it a biblically patterned house church is that we rotate homes, rotate who leads, taking turns, discussion-oriented, not sermon-oriented, so that when you outgrow a house, you just multiply out because a good core group of people have been used to hosting in their homes and or leading and facilitating the meeting. So check it out, cwowi.org. And also our Kids Without Walls International page, kwowi.org. All right, it seemed good today to revisit the issue of forgiveness, which is not a warm and fuzzy feeling that about everything that happened to you in your life. The gospel of the churchianity, of the church culture, says that you must forgive, and therefore it is equated with feeling warm and fuzzy and okay about everything. And what happens is the thing we're born with that cries out for justice, for fairness, for rightness, yells out and says, if I forgive them, they're going to get away with it. Why should I ask God to forgive them? Because they're going to get away with it. I want them, to know what they did to me. And there's a whole host of emotions that goes with that related to the injury that that person's actions caused. And let me tell you that the feeling suddenly warm and fuzzy, that you have to do the hard thing to forgive and suddenly feel warm and fuzzy about that person, maybe, like you think the Lord expects you to let them back in your life or something like that. That's not what the New Testament says. That's not the culture of the New Testament or even the Old Testament. And so I want to share with you from Scripture what the concept of forgiveness is all about. Especially when I'm talking specifically about the trespass. That is one person causing injury to another. Now, there is a law of the trespass. It's outlined in Leviticus chapter 6, especially verses 1 through 4. And the Lord uses a great example. He uses a hypothetical example. And he says this. He says, if there's someone who has stolen his neighbor's coat, or he found something that he knew belonged to his neighbor but did not return it, or if he got something from his neighbor by deceit. And it's not talking about physical neighbor. It's talking about your fellow, in that context, your fellow Israelite. If you got something by deceit, if you found it but didn't return it, if you knowingly stole something from your friend, from your neighbor, he said to be forgiven, you have to do two things. Number one, you have to make it right with the person. And in that making it right, you have to return whatever it was you got by ill-gotten gain. You have to return whatever it was you stole, you found but didn't return it, you took it by deceit. So you have to make it right with them, you have to return it, and he says this, you have to add 20% interest of the value of that item. And then you go to the priest, then you make your sacrifice, and then God will forgive you. And what it's saying is, unless you do that, God's not going to forgive you of that trespass. So there are two elements involved in the law of forgiveness, the law of the trespass, excuse me. There is the vertical. That's God. That's that is the sin against God. And then there is the horizontal, and that is the injury. So that the vertical deals with the sin, but the horizontal deals with the injury. Unfortunately, in the mamby-pamby milquetoast culture of Christianity, we've not been taught about the horizontal. We just think, oh, we have to forgive, and now I'm warm and fuzzy, and we forget, and we're expected to ignore the injury that they caused us, the hurt that they caused us. That's not the biblical way, folks. It involves two elements. If a person wants to be forgiven by God, they have to make it right with God, and the person who was injured needs to ask the Lord to forgive them. But then there's an expectation that that person will make it right horizontally. And so you say, John, okay, they caused me injury. And so, we're not talking about a physical item here like a coat that they stole or took by deceit or found but didn't return to me. So how do they make it right with me? How do they add the 20% interest? Well, Jesus took it out of that realm in Matthew chapter 5 and verses 38 through 48 in the Sermon on the Mount. He's talking to his disciples and he says this. He says, if someone sues you and slaps you on the cheek, don't resist evil, turn the other cheek also. Now, what that example is in Matthew 5:38 is an example of the law of the day for what we would call misdemeanors or minor crimes. And very often what would happen in court is somebody would hurt somebody, somebody would do some damage, some injury. And the court might say, okay, you, sir, are fined 50 shekels, and your neighbor gets to slap you once on the cheek. It goes, but that custom of slapping on the cheek goes, you can think of medieval Europe, where two knights are offended with one another. One boom, slaps them on the cheek and challenges them to a joust or something like that. That custom is very ancient. And so when Jesus is talking about this, he's saying, what he's telling them is, he said, maybe being fined basically 50 shekels, hypothetical example, and a slap on the cheek. Jesus says, so be so willing to add the 20%. Be willing to make it right that you turn the other cheek also, if that's going to settle the issue, if that's going to make it right with the person. It's the equivalent of Leviticus chapter 6, where you add 20% to the value of the coat, or the jacket, or the whatever it was that your neighbor found or stole or took from you by deceit. That 20% value is, hey, turn the other cheek. And so Jesus says the same things. If the judge says give your coat, then you be willing to give your outer coat, your heavy coat as well. Be willing to add that 20%, whatever it is, you try to make it right, to reconcile. And he says, whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go 2. That's an old custom. It started in Babylon during the reign of the Persians, whose empire was vastly larger than Nebuchadnezzar. But the Medo-Persian Empire took in Iran, Iraq, and all the way over to Israel, and it was a larger empire. And so the rule went out that a messenger from the emperor could borrow anybody's beast of burden, their colt, their horse, their mule, their donkey, whatever. I don't know if they had mules back then. Anyway, so the point is that they could do it, but the rule was you had to give it back to the owner after a mile. And so what Jesus says, if that messenger essentially compels you to go 1 mile, you go with them too. Why? Because you're so eager to make it right in the relationship, you want to go that extra mile. But here's the thing. Jesus didn't say become a whipping post, nor did he say give away your wardrobe, nor did he say walk with them a marathon. No, when you forgive a person and you do all you can to express that 20% interest so that you're right vertically and then horizontally, you do all you can. You offer the other cheek, but don't offer the other cheek. Don't boom, boom, boom. Don't become a whipping post. Don't become a boxing bag, for them. It places limits and expectations on the person, that they deal with their injury, that they deal with their guilt, they deal with what they did. In other words, while Jesus said, walk the extra mile, give them your coat, turn the other cheek, it places limits on what you're expected to do. You're not expected to become a doormat. You're expected to stand up and say, okay, one extra time, that's it. After this, you're on your own. That's the gospel way. Now, if you understand this principle that there is the sin and then there is the injury, and that there's an expectation of 20% interest, let's translate that into our day. In Jesus' day, he talked about a misdemeanor court situation. But let's talk about it today. Maybe today in the means of electronic communication, and you ask your friend to forgive you because you said something you shouldn't and you really hurt them. How would you add the 20% interest? Maybe write them a note. Maybe give them a call. Maybe take them out for coffee or tea. Maybe meet them at a restaurant and pick up the bill. Do something. Send them a card, that says, hey, thanks again. I'm so happy we're friends again, or whatever. Send them a card in the mail and say, hey, thanks. I love you. Thank you for your grace in my life. And so you do something. Find a way to more than just over and above is what I'm trying to say. Over and above, just say, hey, forgive me, and that's it. You try to do something to make sure, to be so eager that the relationship has been restored. So when we take this understanding of the Leviticus 6 law of the trespass into the rest of the gospel and the rest of the epistles, remember, Jesus was raised with the law of the trespass. So when you see the word trespass, it's a very important thing. A sin is vertical and a trespass is always horizontal. A trespass is never used for the vertical. So we would say it this way, that if you sin against your brother in Christ, you've sinned a sin. You've sinned a trespass, and it's also a sin against God. So we might say it this way, that all trespasses are sins, but not all sins are trespasses. You follow me? All trespasses are sins, but not all sins are trespasses. So in other words, if you sin against your brother or sister, Paul tells the Corinthians, he said, if you sin against them, you sinned against Christ. So in other words, you're trying to make it right. But so let's talk about that injury a little bit more and the use of the word trespass. In Mark 11:25 and 26, Jesus made this statement: when you stand praying, forgive if you have something against somebody. And he said in verse 26, 27, I believe it is, right at the end of the chapter, he says this, he said, if you don't forgive those who trespass against you, your Father in heaven won't forgive you your trespasses. Now, unfortunately, ignorant but well-meaning pastors and everybody else thinks that's talking heaven and hell. That's not talking heaven and hell. Jesus used the word trespass, and he's stating the Leviticus 6 law of the trespass. If you don't forgive your neighbor's trespass against you, your Father can't forgive your trespasses. It goes right back to the fact that when you do something wrong, you apologize, you make it right, you add the 20% interest, only then can you go to the priest to be forgiven. If that person who caused you injury doesn't do that, they're not forgiven. In a practical sense, what this means is Sister so-and-so who's sitting across the church from you and singing in the choir maybe, and they hurt you and they spoke behind your back and they hurt you all week long, and you're saying, I'm supposed to forgive them, smite them, Lord, that sort of a thing. You can forgive them vertically because you want your heart to be right, but horizontally, it's right for you to expect an apology to your face and them to make it extra sure that you've been restored. And if they don't, the Lord's not forgiving them of that trespass. And you say, well, what's going to happen for them of that trespass? What is that? Well, the best example I can give you is out of 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 15, where Paul chided the Corinthians for having envy and strife and divisions and all that stuff among them. And he went on to say, for time's sake, he said this, not only as he said, you're living like you're not even born again. So he said, I can't even feed you with the milk of the gospel. I should be feeding you meat, and I can't even give you milk. But he said this in verses 11 through 15. He says, if you carry this into your death, unresolved, it's wood, hay, and stubble, and when you come before the Lord, it will be burned away. You will be saved, but it will be like somebody who's come through a fire. So the person will get saved. Sister so-and-so may never make it right with you, and you have to deal with the injury they caused, and you wrestle with that. But you do it, you succeed, and you forgive. That's great. Unless you say, Lord, forgive them and release them from having to make it right with me, they're going to stand before the Lord and have all that part of their life burned away. James 5:16, confess your faults one to another. The word fault there is the word trespass. He's not saying go to somebody who has no idea what went on in your life and confess to them. Admit to them. No. He says, confess one to another, then pray for one another that your relationship can be healed. That's the word trespass. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1 says, you who's overtaken in a fault, and that's the word trespass in the Greek. Restore such a one in spirit of meekness, keeping mind of your own life, lest you also be tempted. And he said, thus you're fulfilling the law of Christ. He said, however, if somebody thinks that they're right, then let them prove it out, for everybody has to bear his own burden. So the law of forgiveness and the injury, just wants you to know you work through this. Me in my life, when my dad left our family when I was 11 and a half years old, and then I came to the Lord when I was age 16, it took me 10 years to work through the injury of that divorce, of that rejection by my dad. Now, I made the decision at age 16, I forgive. And like Jesus from the cross, forgive them, Father, they don't know what they're doing. Or Stephen at the end of Acts chapter 7 says, don't lay this sin to their charge. You can release that injury. You can release that sin and everything. And that's what I did at age 16. Forgive my dad. I forgive him. But it took me 10 years to work through the injury because my dad was never going to come and apologize point by point, broken promises, after broken promises. He was never going to do that. So I had to deal with the injury. So it took me 10 years to work by incident. So what do you do on the practical? When your emotions get stirred up and it makes you mad all over again, you get angry, you work through it. And then at the end of that, you say, okay, but I submit this under my decision to forgive. And then once you do that, you move on. How do you know you've walked in the fullness of the forgiveness where you've forgiven not only the vertical, but also the injury against you? Because the memory remains, but there's no pain associated with it. That's how you know. All right, I say I've gone extra long today. I hope this has been a blessing to you. Look at those verses in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 48. It's talking about the love walk. Look at the Leviticus chapter 6. Look at all these things. CWOWI.org is our website. God bless. Also, 2 interviews on Deep Believer of the YouTube channel. Bye-bye.